All right, gang. So we are getting started here. We're happy to have Jon Nguyen on to talk about whiteboards and why they suck, right? Like whiteboarding interviews and technical stuff. We're also going to chat a little bit about just technical interviews in general. I've heard that there's going to be an exciting announcement made about the No Whiteboard org, but I will have to wait to hear about that from Jon. Other than that, Jon, welcome in. How you doing?
Hey, I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing good. I'm doing good. So just to pull back the curtains by a tiny bit, we've been chatting for a little bit before we've gotten going, and I'm already loving the vibe of like just keeping it casual and hanging out and chatting. So if there's any questions in chat, if there's anything that anyone wants to know, please feel free to ask at any point. We're not like super scripted, have to follow the guidelines like crazy. So
We're doing it all
yeah,
improv.
that's right. We gotta keep it light and breezy and snappy and all the good stuff, right? So, do you want to start by telling us about like what no whiteboard is, and like maybe we can jump into like, the basic overview questions of like, oh, what is whiteboard interviewing? You know?
Yeah, sure. So No Whiteboard is a job board for companies that don't do leak code interviews
Hmm.
and also kind of show their interview process up front. Um, I think I'll kind of go into like a little bit about the mission and then we can kind of go into like the technical stuff. I think
Yeah.
um, an issue with like the tech industry is kind of like the leak code arm war or arms race where companies aren't getting the signal they want from technical interviews. So with those interviews being leak code right now, and so they're just kind of
Hmm.
doubling down and increasing difficulty and hoping
Right.
that it'll work out. And I think like another thing too is companies will put you through like 8 to 10 rounds of interviews and then just kind of ghost you at the end. And so I think the big overall mission is to kind of um, make it so people don't have to prep for months on end to get a new job, and then also during the interview process itself, not have to spend hours for a single company.
Yeah, yeah, because some of these technical interviews can go like I've heard horror stories of like, oh yeah, I have a 3 hour long block dedicated today. And it's like, if you have a job while you're looking, what are you supposed to do there? Like take off work? Like that's not an option for so many people. That's
Yeah,
ridiculous.
it's a lot easier with remote work, but like I mean, in a month or two, with
Yeah.
all these companies going back to in person, I don't know how people are going to do it.
Right, right. Well, and even if you do have remote work, right? Like some people's schedules, like I can only imagine if you're a parent and you also have to take care of this and this, like it's already difficult enough to plan your schedule on a regular week, ignoring trying to set aside like a 6 hour block or a 3 hour block or whatever, even more than once potentially to get that job. It's like, what is happening and why is it so bad, right? Like it
Mhm.
doesn't have to be this way.
Yeah, yeah. Like I think I was asking a physician friend or no a PA. What do you call them? Physician's assistant. I don't know. But I was asking what their interview process is like for that, and it's like he's like, yeah, we just kind of go in. They kind of have a conversation, like see if you're a cool person or not. If you are, then they're like, all right, cool. Like you're in. Like we'll see you whenever. And
Right.
like I was like, what? What, dude?
Yeah.
Like what are you even talking about? That's not even like that. Like I feel like we are
Myth.
so far away from like other industries.
Hmm. Oh, sorry, excuse me. Yeah, and I think a lot of like a good interview process should be helping test like the social skills about like an interviewee, right? Like that doesn't mean that you have to be an extrovert and be the loudest bubbly person, right? But like understanding the generalized like, oh, are they going to be uh amicable in a work environment, right? Are they going to be able to work with other people and contribute in a team, or how is their code review process looks like? Like what are things that they usually look for? Like whenever I ask interview questions, it tends to lean more on those types of things as opposed to what is a linked list and how do you reverse it quick.
Yeah, I think like I don't know if I can use language. I mean, this is pretty basic language, but basically like one, are they an asshole? And two, do they want to learn? Like I feel like at the
Right.
simplest level, that's like all you really want to get from Signal. Like at least for maybe the earlier levels, like a principal engineer, like sure, there's other stuff on top of that, but like
Totally.
at a basic level. Like, I feel like we've really strayed pretty far from that.
Yeah, yeah. And then even with like principal engineers or like higher level engineers, like one of the things that I would tend to ask about is much more how do you do documentation, right? Like what does code comments look like in your projects? And I feel like with leak code, it's like yeah, you could like add code comments about your algorithm or whatnot, right? But I don't know, when you are doing it live in front of other people, it's such an intimidating experience that it's like sweat and bullets over here, Like you're not performing at that same capacity that you would be able to in a normal work environment.
Yeah, I think as well. Like, I mean, yeah, like I think like devs rarely, if ever, have to like even. I would say there's even cases when I'm pairing with new people, like
Hmm.
like I get nervous pairing around new people because I'm like I feel
Oh,
like
yeah.
maybe it stems from interviewing where it's like there's been bad experiences where I'll meet someone new and then like now they're here to like critique like every bit of how I code, and I feel like that's kind of uh, worked its way into the workplace slightly. But I think like after you've coded a bit with them, you're like very comfortable just kind of just talk about life while you're coding. I don't know.
Right. Like I've honestly really come to enjoy pair interviewing or not pair interviewing, pair coding with like people that I like kind of know really well on the team because then it's like, "Oh, how's your wife? What did you all do last week? I heard you took the week off or whatever." Like there's that conversation that you can have. And I think that that's the difference between like pair programming and something like live interviewing is that there's an inherent level of trust with the people that are on your team because you've had those interactions in the past. You've had rapport that's been built up over time. Meanwhile, in an interview, you don't know these people, right? Like, and more than that, they hold a certain. Granted, I'm. This isn't to say that interviewers hold all the power because there's something to be said about an interviewee also interviewing the company, right? But there's an intrinsic level of like, hey, you're on the line here. Like, you have to prove yourself in some way, and that's not. That's a very high stress environment for some.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, to so my girlfriend actually for like the past 2 months or so has been like interviewing and like it's exhausting. I mean,
Oh yeah.
like sure it is a 2 or 3 hour chunk, say overall for an onsite, but like we know the day before, the day of, and like possibly some of the day after, like we are all just mentally exhausted just because like
Right.
that takes a lot to just kind of have to interview in front of someone new and then do multiple rounds of that.
Yeah. And it's almost always when you find out that someone's interviewing, it's like, oh yeah, I've been doing interviews all week long with 5 other places because, that's how, if you get stuck at that first stage of, okay, well, have fun with the leak code questions or have fun with the super intense technical examination, then it's like, okay, well, now what, right? You wait
Mhm.
around and maybe you don't even hear back from the companies, which side note drives me wild when you like do this long interview process and then they don't even let you know that you've been rejected. It's like, oh, I have a special anger for that.
Yeah, dude, I think that's so I to that like that kind of reminds me of like that is the biggest not one of the biggest concerns that people have about take homes, right? Is that like say they'll spend 5 plus hours, they'll do it, they won't get any feedback, like they won't even get like a rejection, and you're just kind of having to email every week out being like, hey, like have you like looked at my thing yet? And so like I think like longer term with my website, like one, I want to emphasize companies. Like, I don't want to just be like, hey, like, no leak code. Like, I don't want that to be the extent of what my website does. Like, I want to start pointing people towards companies that are doing it right with like either a short interview process or like just good tech interviews, different things like that. I think there's a lot of different ways to categorize what makes a good interview. I think it all depends on like the person, right? Like there are people that will say, I'm never going to do a take home, like leak code all the way. But there's also people who are like the exact opposite, and many other places in between that spectrum.
We got a comment from Coding Puppy saying, as a developer with many failed whiteboard interviews because of severe performance anxiety, I'm excited about the idea of no whiteboard. So, I mean,
Hey,
you've definitely got a good project going on.
yeah,
Something that you touched on is like take homes taking multiple hours and whatnot, right? And I think that that's another problem is like take homes, I personally love take homes, right? Like I think that they're an interesting level of challenge, and even as an interviewer, they provide that insight into how someone is able to communicate through their code and work through different problems. But I would never, not only would I not ask someone to take like a 6 hour long take home, which is absurd, right? Like that's someone's entire weekend, right? Depending on like what other responsibilities they have. But then on top of that, you should be enforcing in some capacity or another that people are only spending a certain amount of time on the whiteboards, right? Because what you're doing otherwise is you're allowing bias to show with people that do have more free time, whether it's they have less responsibilities or they're just younger, or like whatever the case may be, right? And I like with CoderPad, we have this feature that allows you to actually explicitly limit how much time someone spends on that take home. And it's like, yeah, you can think about the problem, you can approach it, and then when you're ready to sit down and spend that hour and work on the project, that's fine. And even an hour is, that's about the extent of what I would even start to recommend. But it's ridiculous how long some of these interview processes, especially take homes, kind of expect you to put in.
Yeah, so I haven't done a coder pad take home, but it sounds like they give you a prompt. You can read over the prompt, and then when you're ready, you can like start the timer if you will.
I believe so.
Okay. Yeah, that's pretty cool. Like I my girlfriend had to do a similar one, not on CoderPad. Like basically the recruiter sent over the prompt and was like, "Hey, when I send this prompt over, your timer starts." And I think like that's like I didn't think about it as a gripe, but like a gripe I have where it's like you're like especially for like the leak code problems as well, where you're trying to like read through the problem and like the timer's going down and like you're trying to like understand the problem before you can even think about it. I think like that
Right.
format where you get the prompt first, you can read it, you can understand it, and then like when you feel comfortable, you can start.
Right. And that's a great way. Yeah, totally agree. Because it gives that time for you to be able to think through the problem and process it more. And the other thing that I would love to see more of that we may or may not be working on a little bit is the ability to have feedback for the candidate, right? Like knowing what did you do differently? What could you have done differently in order to improve your interviews? Even if you got the job, there's been a few instances where it's like, hey, congrats on joining our company. You did awesome. We really like this. However, just as a heads up, like in the future interviews, this, and like done in a proper context, I think that can be immensely powerful to a candidate, right?
Mhm. What are your thoughts on like I don't know if companies do this, but what are your thoughts on like companies sending a rubric with the take home? Because like I
Mm,
feel like there are times where say the interviewer or the company is expecting the interviewee to like write tests, but like that wasn't talked about in the prompt, things
right.
like that. And so like I think there are times where people say spend a lot of time working on a take home and they come back and they get rejected, but like they don't know why. But like I think having a good way to kind of see like, oh, like if I compare it to the rubric, like here's what I missed out on versus like, I just wasn't feeling your project, like
Well, and I think that's part of the interview process in general, right? Is like I always hate the word rubric. It's just a personal gripe, right? Because then I'm just imagining going back to high school and getting all those F's and like
yep,
like it makes me sad. Um, but
fair
I,
enough.
I definitely think that there's a lot to that communication aspect, right? Like if the company themselves are not sending proper criteria, then they're not sending proper criteria, right? And I think that that's an important part of sending the right project, right? Is like you shouldn't be sending something that isn't representative of real application development. And if you're sending tickets to your developers that are vague and ambiguous, and like I pronounced that wrong, but just pretend I didn't. Um, but like if you have all this other stuff that's like not correct about a ticket you're shipping to a developer in production, that's not a great environment, right? Like if you have
Yeah,
to ask a million billion clarifying questions, maybe there's a problem in your process pipeline, right? Not to say that you
yeah,
can't ask any questions, right? Like I think that one of the things that I usually recommend for people going through interviews is kind of that idea of, hey, ask clarifying questions before you move on with the question. But there should be some base level of expectation that it's communicated, you know?
Yeah, I think I found like in every aspect of life where it's like most problems can be resolved by just like communicating. Like I think it's
Mhm.
usually both parties aren't aligned on like what expectations are of the other party, and like I think at the end of the day, communication every time.
What are your thoughts on, sorry, this is a question from Coding Puppy again. What are your thoughts on take-home assessments that take over a day to complete? I've had take-home assessments that took me 30 plus hours to complete, and it was building a full stack website off of Figma, and there was so many nitty-gritty details the candidate wanted to complete. They wanted the candidate to complete.
Um, so no, like if the industry moved from leak code to that, I would consider that like a failure. Like
Huge
I would be like,
downgrade.
oh man, I should have deleted my website. Like I should have never made it. Like you, I think I read like you game right. Like
Yeah. Oh yeah.
yeah, so like like the analogy I have in my head is like the like I know like Super Smash Bros. Or whatever has like this like tier list type of thing where it's like S plus,
Right.
A, B, C thing. Like I think like the scenario that Coding Puppy just described, that's like an F minus tier. Like
Yeah.
that's like pretty low tier. Like I think like the higher tier things are like if companies are like paying for you to
Yes.
do their take home, if like it is like time box or like it has a very low like time expectation, like where that's been like evaluated pretty well. Um, I think like real world problems esque is like very high on my list as well. Like I would prefer to not have to code tic tac toe as like my principal engineer type of project. Um, I think just like a few things like that where it's like you feel like one, you can apply those skills that you're learning from the take home. Two, like they're considerate of like people who have lives outside of work. Like I
Right.
technically don't like talking about tech outside of work, but I mean here I am technically. Um, yeah, just being considerate of the candidate, I think at the end of the day. Like anything past 4 hours is kind of stretching it in my head.
Oh yeah. Well, and I think that the frustrating part there is that, oh, you have to build an application from scratch. How much more representative of a production application? No, that's not like how realistically, right? Like let's just look at it from the standpoint of even a senior level engineer, right? If you're a senior level engineer and you're joining the company, how often are you kickstarting brand new projects without any guidelines by yourself? Like it's not going to happen, right? And if it is happening, no, I'm not working there. Like, granted, I have the opportunity to do that, right? Like, I have the privilege and the ability at this point in my career to be able to say no to some job interviews, right? Um, but that sounds like a miserable environment to be on your own to kickstart your own projects repeatedly. Like, you usually have a team that you work with, right? And
Mhm.
much more than that, there's usually set up strict requirements. There's dedicated designers in most companies. Even indie companies will have a certain set of expectation and deadlines, you know? So what I like to see with real world applications is like add an example that is a real production style code base that has two or three bugs, or maybe you want them to add new features, or whatever the case may be, but have them work on an existing code base, right? Because one, they'll get a sense of what code style you're looking for, which you should also clearly communicate, by the way. But then two, you get that idea of what are they actually going to be working like with in a code similar to your production environment. But yeah, 30 hours is absolutely ridiculous. Totally agree. F minus tier. Trash. It's
Yeah,
Kirby
trash
and
too.
Smash Melee. Don't do it.
There we go. Yeah, I'm not familiar with the competitive scene, but I will go to you for that for sure.
I think even Kirby is an F. I think it's like a C. It doesn't matter. What I'm saying is 30 hours is as much time as I spent on Elden Ring the first weekend it launched, and there's
Yeah,
no way I'm doing that for an interview question. That's
right,
absurd.
right. Because every hour you're spending on that, you're like, dude, this could have been Elden Ring. Like
This
this one
could
could have
have
been
been
Elden Ring.
Elden Ring.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Thanks for the
um,
question. That was a good one.
yeah, that was a really good one. And of course, I totally missed out on Derek's question earlier. Comment earlier. Technical interviews are broken IMO, way too arduous and anxiety inducing. Strongly prefer take homes since they're not too time consuming. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Um, I think kind of like an inspiration for starting a whiteboard as well is like I feel like it's a pretty big issue when the main reason you don't want to jump from a job or like you may want to stay at a job that you dislike is because you know how bad the interview process is like in tech. And so you're like kind of like the better the devil I know than the one I don't, which the one you don't is whatever type of leak code question they're going to send to you. Like so like yeah, I agree with you. Like I, I think like my biggest issue was like that's what I was experiencing. Every time I look for a new job, I'm like I already know the next 2+ weeks of my life are gonna suck, and like I would prefer to not make that a universal tech experience for people.
Right, right. Um, yeah, so like what I think we've like vaguely touched on No Whiteboard, your website. I don't think we've actually talked about it much.
Yeah. Um, what's the best way to go about it? Give me a starting question.
Uh, so you'd mentioned that you started it primarily to like get to the point where other people don't have to make their interview experiences like horrible and miserable, right?
Mhm.
What type of like how do you filter out so first of all, what is the website, right? Like
Yeah.
is it a job board or something like that?
Yeah. I would say right now it's just a job board. And if there is like I think the criteria is pretty open-ended in a way where it's like just don't do leak code or leak code-esque problems and just like show your interview process up front and I'll add you to like the website for free. And so um, that's like the basis of it. I'm just kind of pulling jobs from those companies and um, trying to make it as candidate friendly as possible. Like um, if a job description shows the salary, I will post it. Like I'll, dude, regex was I have not used regex like much, but like thank God to my girlfriend who apparently really knows regex. I did not know that. And so like just showing salary because people love to know the salary up front. I
Mhm.
think different things to make it simpler for candidates, like there's like a recruiter contact link where it'll point to like a search for that company's recruiters on LinkedIn. Um, skills on like the job description, I'll parse that out for you and like I'll show it up front. So just a lot of different things that I feel like candidates normally like scan a job description for when they look at a job post like at least like I mean I think I'm biased where I look for features based on what I like use when I'm job searching, so like I will most likely skip over that 7 or 8 paragraph like description of the company until I get a response from the company. I'm just going to look for things that fit what I care about, which at the simplest level is like salary, does it match my skills, and like
Right.
yeah, at a very simple or and the job and the interview process.
So kind of just like the most direct things that like the most clearly communicable things that are on a job board.
Exactly. Yeah.
For sure. How do you find these companies? Do they reach out to you? Do you find them through like other websites? Like how does that work?
Yeah. So my original sourcing was this. There's this very popular GitHub repo called like Hiring Without Whiteboards, and I feel like I've
Mhm.
kind of followed along that repo for like a few years, and which was kind of like my original inspiration. And I think like my website kind of grew out of like that website where the website just kind of shows companies and their interview process, but like I'd find this company that I'm like really in love with, right? And then I'd go to their website, no job openings. So I was like, I don't want to have to like do this every time. And so um, I originally sourced those companies, and um, dude, I'm a nerd. I'm on Reddit. I'm on stuff like that all the time. So like
Right.
people will be like, there will be some thread about people disliking technical interviews, and someone will be like, "Oh, my company doesn't do this." So reaching out to those people, being like, "Hey, what company? Like, what's your interview process?" And people love to share that stuff. And then more recently, Twitter. It seems like there's a thread about technical interviewing every day slash every week, and so
Right.
like it is just this like constant like sourcing of companies where I can just reach out to people on there, and they are more than happy to share the interview process because people want people to join their companies if they love their company.
Yeah, and I think that that's the thing is that like if you're excited, if you've spent a lot of time making sure that your technical interview process is refined, you're excited to share that usually, right? Like you're usually like, look, we're awesome. Come join us. Come hang out with us. You know.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
got another question from Coding Puppy, which by the way, do not apologize. These are great questions, so please, thank you, please and thank you.
yes, and
um,
yes.
do you happen to know what the response rate is for users that apply to a job through No Whiteboard, or do you have any general insight into that statistic?
Um, as in, like, what percent of those people get a response? Is that, am I, you think I'm interpreting it like that?
Yeah, yeah. Or how many people maybe get the job? Yes. Okay. So Coding Puppy clarifies, yeah, the number of people that hear from it.
Um, I'm not really sure at this point. I feel like I definitely cowboy coded my way to getting the website up. And so like I think like the actual metrics on like what percent of people actually apply from my website and then what percent say how far they get in the interview process. Like that is something I was trying to experiment with like a company this week. But I think like the data I have is not granular enough to find that. But like ideally long term, I'm going to be heading towards that path where like my long term belief is that there are a lot of candidates who just pretty much don't look for jobs because they don't want to deal with leak code stuff. And so I would ideally see this website as a funnel for all of those candidates to find companies they care about. And then I think like at a longer term, if enough candidates start getting value from my website, companies are going to see that. They're like, hey, we need to change our interview process because like we don't want to be competing with like FANG companies for that pool of talent. Like, let's find all these other people who are actually really good at their jobs. They've been there for like many, many years and like they've done some really cool stuff at their jobs. And like, let's just go directly to them instead. So,
Right.
long term, very good idea. And I hope I can find a good way to implement that, like, so that I get like as much info as possible.
For sure. Well, if nothing else, it seems like you are making really good progress. I saw your tweet recently that was like, "Oh, we doubled our growth in
Yeah,
terms of like users," which is awesome. It's great to see.
dude, it's wild because like I've basically been a lurker on like Reddit on like I mean I made my Twitter in like December or I started using it in like December and like it's dude there's so many nice messages I get from people and like I didn't realize like I don't know I see a lot of bad stuff on the internet so like having people say nice stuff is like I'm like, no, like that's not how the internet works. But
Yeah,
it's been good so far. Yeah.
you're like, "Where's all the evil and
Yeah.
vile? Like,
Yeah.
what happens?"
Right, right.
That's cool. That's really cool. Uh, so I know that we've talked about how algorithm questions suck a little bit. How much more that do they suck? Like, you know, like what are some of the base problems with algorithm questions in particular? Like outside of like, oh, we just don't like them. It's like, but why don't we like them?
Yeah. I think it's like I think having a I mean it's all the like the matters of um interviews just putting a lot of pressure on you and then I think on top of that having you um be able to kind of regurgitate something that you may not have used in years it's just like stored in your head I think is a major issue where I think it doesn't I think the base concept of we want to evaluate how you problem solve is understandable I think um the bigger issue with it though is that like I guess giving a problem that like you would normally kind of Google for a little bit before you kind of start diving into is it's just hard to get a good signal from that. I think like it's hard to really I'm kind of lost for words here. Like I think like
Yeah, yeah,
algorithms are used in the role, but like I think it's not used every day. It's not used every week. I think it's like it's rare when it's used. Yes, it is useful when it's used, but I think like It would be like asking you to make a REST API. Like, even though you may have done that once at your current job, and that was at the start of your job, I think it's like it's hard to ask for a very specific, you know, use case when there are so many different things that encompass a job.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and the other thing is that it's like it's evaluating a different set of skills than what you would have excuse me, than what you would have in the workplace, right? Like if I'm implementing a sort algorithm, I'm going to most likely see what there is to begin with, like what are the existing algorithms, and then I'm going to do some research into like, okay, well, I need to build a benchmark and compare and contrast between a few different results, right? Like especially if it's an algorithm that's of any importance, you're not going to be building it first try without like any sort of experimentation or testing or whatnot, right? Like the things that I tend to do when building an algorithm, because for example, I have my own blog called Unicorn Utterances, and in that I finally added a recommendation sidebar, right? And I wrote my own algorithm for that sidebar at build time to be able to make sure that it has a pretty decent result, right? And the difficulty there is that that sidebar had to have a bunch of requirements and it had to have tests and whatever. And I think I must have spent a few days on that because it was important that I wanted to get it right, right? So I don't think that there's any objective well, if there is objective correctness, it is so difficult to discover that it's not something that you can figure out the first try, right? And that's not really what problems. I always feel like leak code questions are the first type of thing that come up when it's like, oh, we're going to evaluate on how objectively correct your thing is, as opposed to we're going to evaluate your thought process, which is always super annoying.
Mhm. Yeah,
So
I completely agree. I think like it's definitely over indexing on a part of your career that doesn't necessarily need over indexing.
right,
Or like I think like I said, there's so many different aspects to being a developer. Like you said, like writing tests, uh, make sure it's the right requirements, all these different things that
right,
just don't you don't get any signal for if you spend this much time only focusing on algorithms.
right. Coding Puppy says, "Can you tell us about your best and worst coding experience or interview experiences?" Great question.
You want to start?
Sure, yeah. So I think my worst interview experience was probably I did an interview, take home interview with this company. You know, did the typical phone screen. I actually knew the team beforehand, and it's not like the first stage of the interview was awesome. It was a take home. They had like they made sure that they had a specific time requirement. They're like, hey, please submit this by this time. You know, like they're super upfront. They were super clear about everything. I was able to program the thing. It was like, yes, it was based on existing code. I loved it. And then the second stage of the interview was all technical questions, and it was like first we're going to have you do a live coding interview, and it was like, ooh, okay, we can do that. We can do that. By the way, it's an algorithm question. Ooh, by the way, it's reversing a linked list. Dang it. You know? And then I fumbled through that because I'm terrible with like the traditional CS type stuff because you know like I'm self-taught as an engineer, so like I'm way more used to how to center. I can center a div. It's a magical ability. I know it's very rare. But yeah, I can center a div like there's nobody's business. But then ask me what a linked list is, and it was like I legitimately had to think about what a linked list even was first, right? So I fumbled through that. And then the questions afterwards were like, hey, what is the async versus defer keyword do in a script tag? Like Mozilla Developer Network docs exist for this exact reason. Because I know the vague answer for both of them, but I can't remember which one goes with which. And then it was like, what is the timing pipeline between this and this operation? And it was like, okay, like this feels like such a divergence from application that it's now just in pure theory land. And theory land has a purpose, right? It has a benefit in the workplace. But I always feel like you have to back that up with the ability to search for it, right? Because I'm just not going to remember off the top of my head. So if you were to give me like 10 seconds of Googling, which by the way, I strongly encourage for interviews, please let us Google, like just let us Google. Like it's part of the job, let us Google 100%, right? Um, And if you'd given me 10 seconds to Google and then build a code sample for you based off that Googling, I totally could have. And it felt like I had gotten so far. I was talking to the CTO of the company, and then it just felt like it was stolen away from me. You know,
Mhm.
like it was so frustrating to get that far. And for it, in the end, not even mattering. Yes, that's a reference. um, best interview experience, on the other hand, I think was actually for Hilton. I'll actually name and shame because it wasn't shame. It was a great interview experience. They sent me a take home. And yes, they did a live interview question, but the live interview question was sincerely so well done. And they guided me towards every step that I felt very comfortable with it. Um, and it was overall a really pleasant experience because at the end of the interview, we got to talk about like, oh, well, this is a different way this could have been done. Like they were explicitly giving me answers of how it could have been done. And we had a conversation back and forth about what the benefits were. And at the end of the interview, I realized they weren't just talking with me to shoot the stuff, right? They were talking with me to evaluate how I thought about things as a candidate. And I didn't even realize that they were doing it because they made it such a natural part of the conversation flow, and they did a good job at reassuring me and kind of making sure that I was on a comfortable same page with them. And I thought that was such a cool interview experience with them.
Cool. Yeah, those are some dude. My worst story is like similar to yours, where I call it tech trivia, where like
Oh,
it's like stuff that you can like it's the first thing that you get when you Google search that exact same question, right? Like you will get that like, the exact answer they're looking for. And so like I have two stories. One didn't happen to me, and I will keep the person's name anonymous. But the first worst story was, we'll say myself, where um, basically I think a recruiter was calling me to like give an update for a job after like they did like that initial recruiter screening. Um, and then like after 5 minutes of like talking, they start asking me tech trivia questions. And like I think I did not even know I was about to be interviewed there. So like I was just blown like completely off guard there. And two, I think I hate it when a company like what do you call it, like makes the recruiter ask the do the tech screening for them. Just I think I don't think that really shows much respect to a candidate, especially because the kind of recruiter just like doesn't really understand the nuance of what you're talking about since they kind of just look for particular keywords.
right.
So I think I ended up just like ending that call like two or three questions, and just because I had like an adrenaline rush from like I was like I was not expecting like I was not in interviewing mode. Um, the second one so okay, so this person was doing a systems design interview at the time, and so it was during work hours, and their watch started buzzing, and so like they just wanted to like it was like a smartwatch, so they just like tapped it to like try to silence it, right? And they just kind of continue with the interview. Um, they could not hear anything from the watch, but essentially what happened was the watch was a Microsoft Teams like notification to join a call, and it was a team meeting call. And so this person was kind of like had the interview going on, and they were part of the call, and like they were not muted at all. So the team could like hear this person interviewing like during like with like all the other members of of like their team like listening in. And so um they I don't think they got caught. Like I think someone thought that they were talking to like another person in the room, not like literally interviewing.
Right.
So that was pretty cringy. I'm not gonna give the name because it's embarrassing. I yeah. But okay. Best story, I think there's I've had some pretty good interview experiences. I would say the best one is just kind of from my more recent company. We ended up just doing like I just ended up just doing like a take home assignment. Just kind of like creating like a REST endpoint, and I think like It was pretty well time boxed. I think it only ended up taking me like 2 or 3 hours. And then like the follow on interview was kind of, hey, like let's add a feature on top of what you built. And so like I was already like, yes, it was live coding, but I was already in a problem space that like I was very comfortable with. Like I had worked with very recently. And so like working on the feature, kind of talking about trade-offs that I had to make for my project was a lot easier of a problem space to be for me to be talking about.
Right, right. And it's so nice when it's like about something related to what you're applying for, as opposed to
Mhm.
like, my goodness, I don't know what is going on. I'm so sorry.
All good.
Yeah, it's reassuring when it's like relevant. Great example, the Hilton interview question actually had questions that were specific to booking a hotel room, right? And I was like, that's awesome, right? Like it's so cool to be able to see that experience and be like, oh, here's why we did this testing. We validated and tested and made sure and this didn't work and here's why it didn't work. And that was such useful background because it was like, oh, I get it now. Like this is what they're looking for and this is why they're looking for it. Now I can build it without having to ask so many preliminary questions, right? So when it's relevant to the type of work you're applying for, I think it's awesome.
For sure. Thanks for the question.
Yeah. In fact, we follow up comment. I had Coding Puppy says I had a first round interview that I thought was going to be a simple recruiter screening. Turned out to be a surprise live coding session. They sent me a prompt the minute our interview started. Needless to say, I didn't get that role. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, and that's exactly how it goes sometimes. Um, okay, so I guess the next question would be something along the lines of like, if you're doing an interview, what are the questions you're looking for? Like like what would you ask a candidate?
Hmm. For technical interviews or just in general?
Either or, either and.
Um, that's a good one. I haven't really thought about it too. I'll have you start actually a little bit
Okay,
because yeah, I got to think
I
a little
put you
bit
on
for
the spot here. It wasn't the
that. You're
most
good. You're
questions.
good.
The
Usually I'm
problem
good
is
at
that
improv.
conversation has gone so well, we ran out of the existing questions.
Fair enough.
Uh, Yeah, so for a list of questions that I would ask like an existing candidate, it's funny, like all the classic ones of like, oh, well, why did you leave your previous company so soon? Or why did like I just don't care about so much of the commonplace questions. I'd mentioned previously documentation, right? I
Mhm.
like to come up with like theoretical scenarios of like, hey, there's a bug in the code that you notice from another, like from a part of the code that another team is managing. How do you communicate that, right? And usually the answer is something along the lines of like, oh, well, I'll send them a Slack or I'll send them an email or whatnot. And it's like, okay, let's say that you haven't heard back from them in a few days. What is the follow up, right? Like just generally trying to get a vibe for how they communicate, what they're able to do to help escalate like respectfully escalate things potentially. Not that that's usually a problem in most like coding environments, but it's nice to know or if it's a backend question, like an interview for a backend role, one of my favorite questions is how do you document the API, right? Because
Mhm.
like Open Swagger is a specification, yes, but how do you implement that specification, right? Or how would you build out a GraphQL NP, or like why would you choose a GraphQL endpoint? Stuff that is a lot more like yes, it's integrating the questions or the technical side of things, but it's also like leaning heavily on the social side of communicating with other teams. What do you look for? How do you decide between performance and code readability is another
Mhm.
big one, especially if you're doing a live interview, if you have to do one, then it's like, oh, you wrote this in a way that's much more readable. What are your preferences? You can lead that into a question, right? Like it doesn't, I feel like the best technical screening, like the best live interviews anyways, tend to use the code as a catalyst for a better conversation as opposed to just focusing solely on the code and code.
Yeah. Um, yeah. So okay, questions. I think behavioral. I know a good one that we like to ask engineering managers, which I think is really nice. Is basically like let's say you're dealing with a project where um, like it's getting really close to the deadline. You're not meeting like the features, and you don't necessarily have the budget to add more people. Like what should you cut. Um, just having like a trade-off thing, and basically there's not like it depends on the company which answer is right, but I think like cutting features to meet the deadline is what I would consider a green flag because ideally I'm not wanting to work, you know, overtime to meet deadlines like I think it depends on the company culture, of course, but like I think to me if a manager is like, yeah, I would make like the direct reports like start working Saturdays and Sundays to meet the deadline, it's like okay, like that could work, but you know, maybe not for the company I'm at. Um, I think,
Sorry, hang on a second.
yeah, yeah,
Sorry about that.
all
All
good.
right.
And then I think from a technical, I think I really like the format that you kind of talked is I feel like it's a very like systems designy kind of thing where like I don't think tech is ever really straightforward. Like, and I think that's why like I kind of like the problem space of no whiteboard is that like there's not a one size fits all solution. Like there are trade offs to every decision that have to be made, and so you know saying something like this is the best, like don't argue about it. I think is like is an easy way to like I think like there's never really a this is what works like don't ever argue about it kind of answer to a thing. And so like framing questions in the kind of systems design point of view, I think is like a good way I think to frame questions to kind of see how people think.
Well, and I think that like it's one of those things where you should never be answering never or always questions. You know, like the
Mhm.
tongue in cheek joke there, or like the other one is like the senior engineer says it depends. You know, like
Yes. Yep.
it's one of my favorite memes because it's so true. Every senior engineer I know, and even I'm like, oh, Corbin, how do you do this thing in regex? Well, it depends. Do you want look behinds? Do you want whatever? I
Hmm.
thought it was so funny that you mentioned regex this earlier because I've been spending the last few days writing like a super comprehensive like 8 page already, and that's just the outline guide of regexes, and
Hmm.
I'm
Hmm.
slowly losing. Like I'm like, oh, I can see the symbols. Like,
Regex is it's something else.
sure. There's one interview question that I realized as we were talking that I'd forgotten about that I always try to ask, and it's what are your hobbies? You know,
Mm.
like you gotta add a little bit of like lightheartedness and fun into an interview. And yeah, I always try to ask like, yeah, what are your hobbies and like what do you like doing? And you know, like just kind of seeing what a person is like, and you know, not that it has to inform the
Yeah.
decision making, just to keep things light, you know.
Yeah, I like it. Like I'm not an engineering manager at all, but I actually kind of like it when I see on someone's resume like some sort of hobby or something because I'm like I like to go into the interview room like a few minutes early and just kind of like talk with them like not even interview stuff, but just like kind of like make them feel like I'm an okay person to talk with and just kind of maybe talk about their hobbies and stuff. And I think like it makes it a lot easier to start a conversation, I think, or start an interview at least.
Oh yeah. I remember when I was like first doing my resume before I like really knew what I was doing with my resume. I had a skill tree list with like stars and whatever, and one of them was puns. Like and it was like 4 stars and then a question mark at the end. Like maybe you like them, maybe you don't, you know? And every single interview I walked into at that point was like, "Oh, Corbin, you like puns. Tell us a pun." And I could never think of a pun because you know, it's always
Puns.
situational.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's like I don't know how comedians do it, where you're like, hey, like comedy is very situational. Like, there's not just this like global joke that's just gonna make everyone laugh. Maybe there is. I wish I knew it.
Yeah. See, now I just got to come up with like the perfect systems engineer joke, and then like we'll be
Yeah,
set, right?
your interviews will be a breeze.
It's like tell that joke, boom, you're hired, right? So one of the things that we've talked about, well, we've talked mostly today about like interviewing, right? But we haven't talked too much about like what a candidate can do from the interview perspective, right? What can, let's say you're a junior engineer looking for work, what can you do to kind of help stand out on your resume, do you think?
I think I feel like good side projects, like notable type of side projects, like
Mhm.
are very nice. Like one just from you have question or you have ways to interject those side projects into like your behavioral interviews, like because now you have scenarios to work with.
Right.
Two, like it like I don't know. I see a lot of like or like it's like if you see a certain kind of app, like it's like you can start to associate them with like particular boot camps because it seems like the criteria is like, hey, like you're gonna do these three projects. And so like it's hard to pick between like, those candidates if they're all the same. So like I feel like having a side project that it seems like you actually care about, like that you were doing just to do, I feel like is a good differentiator. Um, yeah, for juniors, it's hard. It's a hard market, man.
Oh
Like,
yeah, it is.
like I'm on Twitter a lot, and like I see a lot of like I think there's a lot of juniors on Twitter, and like, dude, I feel like they work hard, but like it's hard to break into. I feel like.
Oh yeah. And there's so many different avenues that like there's so much different advice that you could give. It's like, well, there's so many hours in a day, right? Like I could give the advice of like, hey, open source was a huge boon to my career, right? Like I maintain some projects that now have it sounds like a big number, but it's like, wow, 2 million downloads a month is crazy. And it's like, yeah,
Yeah,
because the guy behind me did it. And then I just
yeah,
came in and now maintain it, right?
right.
Um, and it's so challenging to tell people, oh yeah, just get into just do whatever is the worst thing that you can say because the
Mhm.
just part there is doing a lot of heavy lifting, right?
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. I think to build off of it, like the issue that I like, even with the advice I just gave, is that like it's all based off of like personal experiences, and it's like I can't use like my n=1 experience to be like this is what works for a majority of juniors because I haven't like dealt with like a majority of the struggles they deal with. Like I don't really know their background. Like I've never done anything open source myself, and so like but say like I'm in the industry, so it's like it's dude, it's very hard to give. I mean, I guess it depends again, right? Like there's
right,
it's like the more we get into this field, the more we don't know.
right. A true senior engineer answer. But you're right. It's totally that survivorship bias, right? Like show the picture of the World War II plane with the bullet holes all
Yep.
over them. Those bullet holes are there because those are the planes that survived, right?
Mhm.
Um, I remember the first time learning about that one. I was like, oh, like it was like such an eye opening. It like, oh, it
Yeah.
makes so much sense.
Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, there's yeah, and that's the issue with like social media as well, is right. You see a lot of like the positive or like what works for people, but like you don't necessarily see the number of people who have done that same thing and it didn't work for them. So it's hard. I don't know. I don't want to be I don't want to be the face of like here like do these three things to get a job easy because I know there's a lot of people that is not going to work for. So
Right, right. Man, this has been such an awesome conversation. I figure we can close it out, but before we do, you had mentioned Smash Bros earlier, and I can't be a gamer without leaving that alone. Who do you main?
dude, I barely even play it. Like this
Oh,
like that I just know like if I'm at a party, I'll play it, right? But like
right.
yeah, unfortunately, yeah, I don't really know. I'm sorry.
See, Derek's in here with Mr. Game and Watch. Oh man, I'm so
No.
sad. I had like this
Yeah.
whole thing, this whole rigmarole lined up. Okay, but
Yeah.
are you a gamer at least?
Yeah, yeah. Unfortunately, I've been playing a lot of League with my girlfriend.
Nice, nice. I love the word "unfortunately" because that's how every conversation with every league fan I know goes. It's
Yeah.
like, oh, unfortunately.
Yeah. I guess I can give my big announcement, right? Like,
Yeah, please
might as
do.
well. Yeah. I think tomorrow I'm putting in my 2 weeks, and I'll be trying to go full time on no whiteboard.
Wow, that is incredible. That's awesome. Huge kudos to you. And I absolutely wish the best of luck. You're gonna crush it. You're gonna do great.
Yeah,
So
I hope the positive words that everyone sends me every so often turns out. Either way, I've been wanting to do something like this for a while, so it's going to be fun for me regardless.
Right, right. Well, if nothing else, I would be happy to have you on in the future to chat more about because so we've talked in the past with like James Quick or James Perkins about like this idea of like creating a SaaS, right?
Hmm.
And what that involves and like I mean, arguably, if you do plan on monetizing no whiteboard, like that's kind of that same process, right? So like I would always
Yeah,
love to hear like, what your learnings were or you know like what led you to down that path because there's a whole hour-long conversation there as well that I would love to hear at some point.
yeah,
But you're
no,
all
for sure. This was fun. I'd love to be a guest again. I, yeah, I think there's not enough stories of people starting out and like you only see them when they're already super successful. So you heard it here first, I guess. And I guess I guess we would see the progression on CoderPad streams.
look forward to it. Well, hey, huge congrats once again. It's going to be
Thank
awesome.
you.
And then
Thanks.
chat, it has been great hanging out and until next time.